Hi, this is Scott Houston, and welcome to another episode of Learning with Power. And in this episode, we will talk about, or in this lecture, you could say, we're going to talk about the history of religion and of the Bible. And it kind of coincides with the history series in that, unlike what a lot of anthropologists or archaeologists or what historians or whatever say, religion has been with mankind since the beginning of mankind. I mean, since mankind was able to think, we had religion, basically ever since that time. And literally every ancient site that they discover usually always has significant religious significance. And really, religion is a lot of people today naturally are predisposed to being religious. There's actually a thing called a God gene that they've discovered. And so these people that you know about who, they think about religion all the time. You know, it's just 24 hours a day, it's all about God and thinking about religion. So they always want to give thanks to God and say, you know, it's all because of God and He's in my life and blah, blah, blah. And people that, they stand out on the street corners and are like, repent, whatever. All these people have probably a God gene, and they found that most of them do. There is such a thing as a God gene in our brain that predisposes us to want to, believe in religion, or God or whatever. Okay, but everybody, and I'll say most everybody has some type of a predisponence to being religious in some way. So religion is really a form of superstition. So if you believe in any kind of superstition at all, that's the foundation for being religious. So if you're like, well, I've been doing it this way like Jim Palmer used to eat a stack of pancakes before he would pitch, and that was his superstition. And so if he didn't eat this stack of pancakes on game day, he felt like he couldn't pitch a good game. So, I mean, there's no reason for that. There's no correlation between it, if you step on a crack or you don't step on a crack, or anything that people do for superstitious reasons or don't do for superstitious reasons. That is a foundation for a belief in God. And because there's no logical connection, but it's some belief that some sort of magical, powerful force that's bigger than us, some force out there that, controls things, is going to get angry if I don't eat a stack of pancakes before I pitch today. And I'm just not going to be able to have my best game if I don't do that. And I'm not picking on Jim Palmer, but I'm just saying it's an example. But any type of superstition and most people have something that they're superstitious about. Most people do. So, I mean, it's part of our psyche. It's in us. It's inbred in us, and it has been since the beginning of man. Doesn't necessarily mean that all of the religious narratives are true, because that's what they are, in fact, is narratives. And what's a narrative? A narrative is basically a story. So it's just the same as Stephen King writing a novel or something that's a narrative. It's a story. So, his books are not true stories, they're fiction, but that's a narrative. And any kind of religion is just a narrative. And then, people either believe it or they don't. And there's a lot of ancient religions that people used to really, really, really believe. Wholeheartedly believe. Masses of people believed in these religions. Christians are not Hindus. They don't believe in any of the Vedics in Hindu necessarily. But there's a huge celebration or religious phenomenon that's happening in India recently. There's this huge Hindu get-together that something like 30 million people are attending. 30 million people hanging around one venue. It's amazing. And it's all because they all sincerely believe in this religion. And that's different from Christianity. Christians would be like, oh, well, they're all crazy. Well, 30 million people are there who certainly don't think that they're crazy. So that's what religious narratives are. You know, they're narratives, they're stories that people either choose to believe or they choose to not believe. You know, religion has been around for a long time. Now, recorded religion, of course, has only been around since we've been recording things. You know, so prehistoric religions are not recorded, and so a lot of archaeologists or anthropologists that propose that, well, with civilization comes religion. That's a bunch of crap. Religion was around always. There was always religion. Civilization didn't suddenly make people want to have religion. Maybe it was the beginning of having more organized religion, but we had some fairly sophisticated organized religions, so they can notice that even though they weren't in the same tribe, that different groups of people within the same area still had similar religious ideology. So that wasn't really organized, but it was something that like a lot of different people in an area, an entire region, all believed very similar sorts of things. So it's not as religious as, you know, you can have if you have an organized society or an organized culture or whatever, but it was still somewhat of a consistent, you know, organized religion, and it was a narrative that a lot of people believed in. So let's talk about the history of religion. So actually the very first incidents of or sign or anything that we can discover in archaeology that lends itself to a belief in religion is that it seems that the earliest burial that we have ever discovered was about 100,000 years ago in the Middle East. Now, you have to, if you're a hunter and gatherer and you're nomadic and you move around a lot, there's really no practical reason to bury somebody. It doesn't matter that the earth will, nature will take it back. But if you live in a society, you can't have dead bodies hanging around because that just brings in disease. But if you're nomadic, there's not really a practical reason for burial. So why did they burial? And not only was it a burial, but there were certain ritualistic aspects of it, like they were buried with certain objects and things, which is an indication that they had some sort of a belief. They believed that this was beneficial somehow, maybe to them or to their soul or to the tribe or something. But it's a sign of some sort of belief. And this was 100,000 years ago. This is not at the beginning of civilization. This is way thousands, tens of thousands of years before there was ever any kind of civilization. And they even have discovered various ritualistic burials that Neanderthals did. And basically, the ritualistic burials of Neanderthals actually stop at the time that Homo sapiens emerged and became dominant in southern Europe. And then Neanderthals didn't seem to do these burials anymore. And I guess it's because they became, it sort of coincides exactly. And I guess it's because they became more nomadic. I guess they were on the run a lot, or they were trying to avoid the humans, which they were both humans. It's just that one is archaic human, as the other is more like a modern human. All right. So ritualistic burials have taken place, for tens of thousands of years. And in fact, the oldest figurine that archaeologists have ever discovered is called the Lowenmensch, or the lion. Lowenmensch in German means lion man. And in Germany, they discovered this lion man figurine 38,000 years ago. And they wonder, how long did it take them to, people were hunters and gatherers, and 38,000 years ago, they were definitely hunters and gatherers. So how could the tribe allocate somebody to, and they reckoned that it probably took them up to 370 hours to make this. So that's like 10 weeks of work, or at least a month and a half, let's say, of work. And So how can they allocate a member of their tribe to spend that much time making a figurine if it wasn't in some way important, you know, if it wasn't somehow significant? And they have since found smaller, similar looking figurines in other burial sites like near Germany, like around the area, from around the same time. So it obviously was some sort of religion that existed at that time. They've even found similar looking images in some of the early cave paintings, like cave drawings and things that they found from 30,000+ years ago. So it was obviously a thing. Also, most of the burials at that time were done with they used red ochre to like paint the face or to like paint any kind of clothing or whatever. It was intimately involved in a lot of burials. And there's no practical reason for this. Why use the red ochre, which is used a lot in Hinduism now, today, but they were using it, tens of thousands of years ago with burials that they did. Why use red ochre if there wasn't some kind of a ceremony or a ritual happening? And why have some kind of a ritual if you don't have, if it's not for religion? Of course, it's religiously connected. In India, around 8,000 BC, so it's 10,000 years ago, there's a stone there called the Bagaur stone. And it's like the earliest religious object that exists within India. And so this would be right around the time of like the Indus Valley people. And then of course you have Göbekli Tepe, which I talked about in the 8000 BC episode. It's one of the very first civilizations, but it wasn't really a civilization. It was really more like Stonehenge. It was more of like a religious site. It was clearly built, structures that were built by civilized sort of people, and it was sort of like a big cathedral or some sort of place of worship that people would come from miles around to come and gather and pray in some regard. So obviously that was some sort of a religious object. It's obviously not Christian. It's not Muslim, it's not even Buddhist. But it was definitely some kind of religious object. It is a religious object. I mean, they are religious objects. They're pretty certain about that. And so there obviously had to be a narrative associated with those objects. And so that means a story, some kind of explanation as to why these are important. Now, mostly these are basically portraying gods of some kind. So like the Lion Man and things like that, those are all types of gods, okay? And all the earliest religions, all of them, were polytheistic, meaning they believed in lots of gods, like the god of war, the god of fertility, the god of money, or the god of prosperity, or the god of, the sun, or the god of the moon, or the god of the night, or the god of death, all early cultures, or all early religions, were all polytheistic. It was rare to have a monotheistic religion where they believed that there was one God. That was unusual, and we'll get to that soon. But not yet. That doesn't come up in history until 1350 BC. So any religion before 1350 BC, as far as anybody knows, as far as we've been able to determine, everyone is polytheistic. And so that includes, of course, what they call Greek and Roman mythology. We call it mythology because it's like, well, it's not true. But for them it was. For them it was real. For them the gods were real. As real as you and me, and as real as any Christian god. And in ancient, the Aztecs, had ritualistic human sacrifices that they believed in. And imagine, you wouldn't allow the priest to murder your baby for a sacrifice to the gods unless you really believed that there was a good reason for it. You have to really believe pretty strongly in that religion in order to stand by and allow human sacrifice. Because if the people didn't really approve of the human sacrifice, they greatly outnumbered the priests. They could just have a rebellion and say, we don't believe in any of this stuff. But they didn't do that. They allowed the human sacrifice, the custom of human sacrifice to persist. So they must have believed it. They must have really thought that it was necessary. You know, an evil necessity. About 9,000 years ago, so like 7,000 BC, in Jordan, there are what's called the Ain Ghazal statues. And they look really weird. They're like these like plaster Paris like faces and stuff. But they really think that they clearly had religious significance. And of course, you know, in Jordan today, they're Muslim. Those statues have nothing to do with Muhammad or anything like that. But yet they are very, very, you know, it was a clear religion at that time. And that was like 7,000 BC. And we only know that not from any kind of text. We know that from just archaeological discoveries and being able to date it in an archaeological method. The earliest religion that's organized from an organized culture and society and civilization that existed, the first civilization that had religion, was really the earliest civilization that's known about, and that's the Sumerians. And that's 3,500 BC, so that's like 5,500 years ago. And the Sumerians actually had a very organized religion. Well, we know that it is because they have text. There's all kinds of these cuneiform tablets that all of this stuff is written down on, and it survives even today. So we know what their religion was like. We know what the narratives, or a lot of the narratives were. We know what the names of their gods were, and what they were the god of this or the god of that. We know that they had a lot of, it was polytheistic. There was a lot of rituals. They had a lot of ceremonies. They had places that they built in ancient Sumeria called zoggurats, which are basically temples or churches, you could say. And they had annual festivals that would happen, religious festivals. So, really not unlike today, not unlike modern 21st century culture. You know, modern 21st century culture, we've got figurines, we've got Jesus, you know, on the cross, we've got temples, we've got churches, we've got festivals like Christmas and Easter and others. It's not unlike today. And it's certainly very much like the same exact culture that they had in Greece and the same exact culture that they had in Roman times. And also the ancient Minoans had a polytheistic religion, and they appear in around 2200 BC. So they were also the same thing. It was the same, basically. You had lots of different gods, the god of this, the god of that, the god of death, the god of fertility, whatever. And they had, you know, figurines, they had temples, they had festivals, you know, just like today. Then 3,000 years ago, there's Stonehenge, and this is a phenomenon that's not just isolated in that area. It kind of was all around that area. Again, it was sort of a narrative that persisted for the entire region, because in Ireland, there's a place called Newgrange, which is very similar to Stonehenge. It's not as big, it's not as grand, but it's a very similar kind of thing. And they're pretty certain that this had very religious significance, and that they were very much like the Göbekli Tepe things that they discovered. The obelisks that they erected at Göbekli Tepe are not really unlike the stones that are standing at Stonehenge. Very similar sorts of concept. And so that was a common thing of Neolithic man. So that's like 5,000 years ago. Then, 2600 BC is the oldest Egyptian pyramid. And again, this is all about religion. This is all about their religion. They believed that this would help usher the king or the pharaoh into the afterlife, and that they would have a successful transition into the afterlife, and that they would bring with them all their servants and all their power and prestige, and bring it with them into the afterlife. And the better the pyramid, the better the prospects of that. Okay. I talked about the Minoans. We go back to 1500 BC in India, and this is when you have the very oldest, the very first, what are called Vedics in India. Vedics, which are scriptures, basically. So it's basically the beginning of Hinduism. Goes back to about 1500 BC in India. And around 1000 BC is the actual Veda called the Rig Veda, which is recorded. They have recorded evidence, and it actually talks about the Rudra and the Shiva. Hi. Okay, so we left off with discussing the ancient Shiva, and 1000 BC was the Rig Veda, which is the Rig scripture, and it's the first mention of Shiva, which is the Hindu god. That's, you know, the god in the Hindu religion. And Zoroastrian religion started around this time also. And Zoroastrian is very similar to Hinduism, and Zoroastrian is the religion of the Middle East before it became Muslim. So you know, Iran and Persia and all of that, Iraq and everything, they were Zoroastrian. So think of like the Arabian Nights, or the Thief of Baghdad, those kinds of stories, and the lady with all the arms and stuff, and you know, that's Zoroastrian. That's the Zoroastrian religion, and that was what they had until about 600 AD. It was a pretty big religion. There's not too many people anymore that still practice Zoroastrian. There are some. So anyway. All right, so that brings us up to around 1350 BC. The next big event that happened in the history of religion was the reign of Akhenaten. That's actually King Tut's father. And you can always recognize in Egypt any statue or image of Akhenaten. Akhenaten, Akhenaten, because he's got kind of like a sort of more cartoony type features and more kind of like, yeah, like cartoony like looking features, you know, like Elmer Fudd or something. He looks more like that, and that's actually and he changed the religion of Egypt. And he decided that we were going to have a monotheistic religion, one God. And as far as anybody knows, that is the first instance of where somebody decided that, no, there's just one God. Polytheism, forget all that. There's not the God of this, there's not the God of this. They're all the same God. There's only one God. And the people, of course, though, when you do these radical religious changes, you know, the people aren't real cool about that, especially because it interferes with their festivals and things like that. But it also interferes with things that they want to believe, the things that they were comfortable and happy believing because they were raised and brought up their whole life believing in this. And now, wait a minute, you're telling me that was all wrong? People don't like that. People want to just live in their echo chambers, and they want to live in their happy little world, no matter how fraudulent that is. So people don't like changes. And so, anyway, he decided that we were going to have monotheism, which is really what brought about his own demise. And it's what also brought about the swift demise of his son, King Tut. And it's why King Tut is the one guy that they found that had so much, that had all of his gold, and he was not rated, because when he was buried hastily in a tomb that was not necessarily befitting of a pharaoh, and it was sort of a secretive place that was already kind of built, that they could just kind of move him into it, and nobody knew about it. And because it happened so quickly, and because it happened in a secret way, is why he happened to be like the one pharaoh that was buried where he had a full royal burial because he was the pharaoh, he was the king, but it was not raided. And so a lot of people in archaeology are like, we talk about Egypt archaeology, say, oh, the Egyptians had so much gold, and all these pharaohs all had so much gold, and they were so rich. But if you notice, sort of the wealth of Egypt sort of diminishes after King Tut. And I think it's because all the wealth of the pharaohs was always the same wealth. You know, the old pharaoh would die, and they would bury all the gold with the old pharaoh. They would go in and raid it, and the new pharaoh would take all the gold back again, and then he's rich. But that didn't happen with King Tut. And so then the next pharaoh that took over didn't have all this gold necessarily, you know, and so suddenly he was not as rich. And so that's why people are like, oh, they had lots of gold. I don't think they really had that much gold. I think most of it exists in King Tut's tomb. That was most of the ancient gold that there was, and they just weren't able to find it, and they weren't able to raid it, and so that's why it still exists today, and we were able to find it today. But the reason why King Tut died has everything to do with the fact that his father introduced monotheism, like I said, which the people were not happy about. All right. So that brings us to 1300s, 1300 BC, which is 3,300 years ago, 3,400 years ago almost. The Shang dynasty in China, which is the first earliest written documentation that we have really from China. And that was the Shang dynasty, and they had a very distinctive religion, and it was a polytheistic religion, much like the ancient Hindu or Zoroastrianism or any of those other Sumerian religions or whatever. It was polytheistic. They had temples, they had rituals, they had festivals, you know, it was all the same thing. In the around 1200 BC, we have evidence of the people called the Olmecs. And they are from Central America, and they built pyramids. Much like the pyramids of Egypt, but actually more like the pyramids that you can find in like Sudan. So in Sudan, there's this row of pyramids that they built. It's called the Upper Nile. They were like the Upper Nile River people that happened to be in Sudan. And they built pyramids also. They weren't as grand as the big pyramids of Giza and the big pyramid of Saqqara, but it was but nonetheless pyramids. And so they're more similar to like the pyramids that like you find in Central America. And I already mentioned how they did human sacrifice in Central America, and those pyramids still stand today, and those are called the Olmec people. All right, so then it brings us to one of the most magical, one of the most significant, one of the most important periods of history in terms of religion, and that is the era of around 600 BC, 600-ish BC. Lots of major religious upheaval happened around 600 BC, and it seems to be a thing that happens every 600 years. You know, there was 600 BC, there's around 0, you know, and then there's around 600 AD is when Muhammad came around. So we have significant religious upheaval, it seems, every 600 years. Okay, and then 600 years after that, you got the Renaissance. You could say that was religious upheaval as well, because it ultimately led to the Reformation, Protestantism, stuff like that. All right. So the things that happened in 600 BC was you have the emergence of Krishna in India, but also Buddha himself, whose real name was actually called Siddhartha Gautama. And he is a real person. We can verify that that was a real person. And he was born around 563 BC. He's buried. We know where he's buried. He had temples. He wrote stuff that's recorded in history. And so we know that he existed. And so that's basically the beginning of Buddhism. It's also the beginning of the Hebrew Torah, which is actually the foundation for the Old Testament of the Bible. And remember I said before this was going to be about history of religion and also the history of the Bible. So I'm going to start talking about the history of the Bible now. So and I'll get back to that. So the Torah, the Hebrew Torah, we'll get back to that, started around 600 BC. And not that it was written down at that time, but we believe that that's when the narrative emerged or was created or whatever. It's when they started saying this narrative. Also, Zoroastrianism was well established now, and it was documented now in Persia. And it's the first actual documentation of Zoroastrianism. I said it probably dates to further than that, but there's not documentation of it, but probably, it didn't come out of nowhere. And it's closely connected to Hinduism anyway. So, and also Confucius in China was born in 551 BC, around 551 BC. So all over the world, all over the known world at that time, huge religious upheaval was taking place. And now we're going to get back to the Hebrews. So the reason why that became a problem is because, again, they were monotheistic. And this was, again, a new radical idea. We tried it before. It didn't really go over very well. Well, they're trying it again. And the Hebrews were very, very determined, to be monotheistic. And the earliest stories or narratives of the Bible or of the Old Testament, which was the Hebrew Torah, is like the story of Genesis. And so that's like the earliest story of the Bible. And mostly the Bible at that time was mostly Genesis, what you find in Genesis. That was like the religious narrative of the time. And then that there was one God and he created the earth and all that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. So hang on to that. We'll get back to it. There's some other things that happened. So around 447 BC is when the Greeks built the Parthenon. And the Parthenon was actually built for Athena, the goddess Athena. That's why they built the Parthenon. So this was a very significant religious structure that was built that still stands today. And in fact, in 399 BC in ancient Greece, very famous Greek philosopher called Socrates, maybe the most famous of all, was tried and ultimately executed for impiety. So he wasn't being true enough to the religion. He wasn't being religious enough. He wasn't being respectful enough. He wasn't being, religious enough in his daily life as far as they were concerned. And so he was executed for not being religious enough. Society didn't like that. He had these other ideas that, that's not good. We don't like that. And so he was executed, basically, for not believing sincerely enough in all of the various gods of Greek, it's called now Greek mythology, but it was a Greek religion. And actually, it was called the 12 Gods religion, the 12 Gods religion. So Greek religion, or Greek mythology, and Roman religion all had 12 main gods. So they're both referred to as like the 12 gods religion. Okay, so that brings us to the Bible. All right, so now I am not trying to be anti-society. I'm not angry about it. I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not doing this because I have for any reason other than just that, just simply, these are the facts. Believe what you want. That's fine. I'm not saying that faith is not important. I'm not saying that spirituality is not important or doesn't exist. I'm not saying that people are stupid to pray and things. A religion still, all throughout history and still certainly today, definitely has a place within society, a very strong place within society. It's very, it helps people, they help people all the time. It's a very, very altruistic sort of thing. So I'm not, anti-religion necessarily. I'm just saying, though, that in regarding the various religious narratives that have existed throughout history and that still exist and are practiced today, these are the facts. And then you can make of it what you want. It's up to you. And I don't really care what you decide to do. It's entirely your choice. I'm not here to try to convince you you're wrong. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just presenting the facts. So I want that to be made very clear. All right, so let's talk about the Bible. So where did the New Testament originate from? So by the time the Bible came around, we already had Jewish people being severely persecuted by the Romans because of their monotheistic religion that they were holding on to very, very dearly. But people were Jewish people even, were having a lot of problems with their own religion because it seemed like it was a religion for only for rich people. The richer you were, the more blessings you had. Does that sound familiar? Like buying, what were they called, tributes or whatever, in the 1500s that you had to do if you wanted your ancestor to get out of purgatory. You had to give the Catholic Church money, kind of the same thing. And so they were getting upset about the fact that it seemed like only the rich people were getting the best blessings. Now, there's some things about religion that I did forget to mention, and there's also something about writing that I forgot to mention in my last lecture. So I'm going to digress before I get into the whole Bible thing and the New Testament. Because the Old Testament by that time was pretty much developed. And so the Torah was pretty much developed. And we have some early scriptures of the Torah, which became the Old Testament, that even predates the year zero. So we know that it was eventually written down, and that was their Bible, you could say, or the religious text that they followed. And okay, the origins of religion. Let's go back to the origins of religion. So the reason why mankind created religion to begin with, the reason why religion is such an important part of who humans are, is because basically when humans first evolved and they were first able to have consciousness and think, and I'm here, I think, therefore I am, that kind of thing. They started to think, well, gee, how did all this stuff get here? How did that happen? What happens to me or anybody when we die? Gee, that natural disaster was horrible. That flood, wiped out that entire valley and destroyed the crops for the whole year, and we're going to have famine for 6 months now. How did that happen? That was terrible. How do we stop that from happening in the future? And so they didn't know what God was or what those forces were. They just knew that they were very, very strong and powerful, way more powerful than humans, much bigger than they were. And so they believed in something that was much bigger than them, that controlled forces that affected their daily lives. And they needed to find a way to feel like they could get a hold of that and control that and say, you know what, if we just do this, 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 and pray to this God, then he won't wipe out the crops anymore. That's going to be a one-off thing. Won't happen again, as long as we make him happy. He was angry at that time. Now we're going to make him happy. Now you can rest, peacefully. You can have a snug, peaceful rest tonight, knowing that the God is appeased and that won't happen again. So don't worry about that. And that's the foundation of religion. All religion basically answers those same sort of questions. And as long as we had a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, ignorance, if you want, religious narratives were very easy to propagate and to carry out, because nobody knew any better. Nobody could prove any better. Nobody could say any better. Everybody in society said, this is true. This is the God of somebody. You have to do this thing to appease to the God. Okay, well, who are you to say that that's not true? And I mean, it was Everybody was saying it. Everybody in your society and culture said it. And if you didn't believe it, you were outcast. And why should you not believe it? And if you did believe it, you're part of the group. You're part of the culture. You're embraced. You're taken in. They take care of you if you get sick. Things like that. So it behooved you to just go along with it and just believe. So that was the history there. Okay, and now going back to writing. About narratives, talking about narratives, okay, about creating narratives. If you're writing I forgot to mention one key element to writing a movie, and that is that to make the movie good, and you'll find that this is the case with most all good movies, the protagonist, it has to seem like everything is against them. It's all going to be over for them. It's all coming to a head, and it's going to be disaster. And what they do is they snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat. At the last second, they turn things around, and they win, and they're victorious, and we have a happy ending and all that. And most stories have that element. And if you don't have that element in a story, it's just not going to be that interesting. It may be real, but reality, real life, it's not that interesting. The reason why we have art is not to portray everyday doldrums. It's to portray things that are interesting. Anyway, or else, it's just not interesting. All right, and so while we're talking about points that I forgot in past lectures, I also would like to add another point. And that is in my lecture about 8000 BC, I was talking about the earliest civilizations and the earliest homes and dwellings that had been built that we've ever discovered that are in present-day Turkey. And it's important to note that the first dwellings that were ever built were built subterranean, were built like into the earth. And then there's just stuck out of the earth a little bit, and then a roof was put on top of that, like a thatched roof of some kind. And that's what the very first dwellings were like. And a lot of that had to do with, it prevented fire more easily. It was more easily sort of defendable. And also the inside the earth, worked as would cool you in the summertime, and it would keep things warmer in the wintertime. So that was another reason for that. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, and so I'm about out of time on this lecture, so this lecture is going to be called The History of Religion. And the next lecture that I'm going to do is going to be specifically going to be about the history of the Bible. And so that's going to be this thing. I just wanted to show this to you in this lecture. So this is from the mid-19th century, and it's actually called a Bible encyclopedia, because that's what they became eventually. They eventually became the sum of all knowledge. People used to say it in those days, everything you need to know in the whole world is right here in this here book. Nothing, if God wanted you to know anything else, He'd tell you. Otherwise, everything is here. Everything you need to know in the whole world is right here. And then that spread into actual encyclopedias, which were like maybe 20 volumes or so, or longer. It would take up an entire bookshelf in your home. But I remember looking at our set of encyclopedias when I was a kid, and I would think, is that really everything? Is that all we know? Is that the sum total knowledge of all mankind? Is that really it? There's got to be more than that. And so today we have things like Wikipedia, which if you actually would put in writing and bind it like this, like a book, or these were called codexes, it would be 10,000 volumes long at this point. Lots of knowledge. So, but we're going to talk about that more when we talk about the history of the Bible. The other thing I want to mention is this book here. So when we talk about the history, we can't talk about the history of the Bible without addressing this topic, because this really is the elephant in the room, you could say. And that is, on the historicity of Jesus. And was Jesus really real, or is he just sort of a part of a narrative and a spiritual thing? And this was written by a guy named Richard Carrier. I highly recommend this book if you have any interest in the subject at all. I'll talk about this more in the next lecture about how he came to write this book. But he did not write it again because he was against religion. Actually, he was very religious. He was asked by other people to do research on it, and he fully expected that he would discover what all of the religious historians maintain. But as he did more research, he didn't necessarily find that what they were saying was entirely true. And we'll get to that in the next lecture. Okay, and so be sure you stay tuned for those lectures. I don't know if I'll do it in the next lecture entirely or if I'll do one more lecture after that. I haven't decided yet. But the next lecture is going to be the history of the Bible. And so until then, please like, subscribe, share, and thank you for tuning in for this one, and tune in next time. And until then, I'm Scott Houston, and you have a great day.